Paul's letter to the Philippians. We've been spending some time with various segments for that, and we're now reaching the end of his letter to the Philippians. So we're going to be referencing today Philippians chapter 4, verses 1 through 9. Paul is speaking directly to the people. Therefore, my brothers and sisters, whom I love and long for, my joy and crown, stand firm in the Lord in this way, my beloved. I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you also, my loyal companion, help these women, for they have struggled beside me in the work of the gospel, together with Clement, and set the rest of my co-workers whose names are in the book of life. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again I say, rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. Be not anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Jesus Christ. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, if there is anything worthy of praise, think about these things. As for the things that you have learned and received and heard and noticed in me, do them, and the God of peace will be with you. The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. In my time as a pastor, as your pastor, I have observed there's a code language among other ministers that they use from time to time, communicate with each other. And they'll say something, well, family systems theory that I studied in seminary would explain that, whatever that is. And the others knowingly nod their heads, the club is acknowledged, and the conversation moves on. Makes me feel a little bit like an outsider. I know just enough about family systems theory, basically from my spouse, to say that there are likely some truth in what they are saying. And I also know that any one theory, any one science is not likely to explain all behavior and may well not do much to help with whatever discussion is really about. I think we need to know what is going on before determining with confidence what theory applies or what next steps should be. This is particularly true in dealing with conflict. Jumping to conclusions is dangerous in dealing with conflict. Family conflict among the Philippians, like Paul is dealing with in this text, is certainly a key example. We know that most families can name times when their families, nuclear or extended, have had disagreements. It can be very painful. Most faith communities can name a time when their church or synagogue or mosque has had disagreements, and it can be very painful as well. When disagreement grows intense, it can lead to division and departures. These can be life-changing and unforgettable experiences. We know this to be true for families. We know this to be true for our churches. That is just reality, uncomfortable as it may be. But it can also result in either positive or negative outcomes. Now, in our reading today, we learn there's a disagreement in the church in Philippi. Many, if not most, immediately jump to the conclusion that this is a big deal, and this is why Paul is writing them a letter. I've done that. Assume the letter is about some major conflict in Philippi. Paul better get on it. But there's a different voice from a Reverend Tom R. that says, wait a minute, if we study this carefully, this is unlikely. He would make the case, he would say there are good reasons to assume the disagreement was actually relatively minor. He further makes the case that the disagreement would not have to be major for Paul to speak to it. In his study of Paul, he finds that there was never a time when he took disagreement or division in the church lightly at any level. Even in Philippi, which is actually a fairly mature faith community in terms of that day, disagreement in the flock, even if minor, demands the apostles' attention. Now, Reverend R. makes the case that the issue is likely minor. Yet, even minor things, Paul says, pay attention. Small disagreements can become large divisions if not addressed. Also remember, when the church is in conflict, it is never at its best as a witness to Christ. Now that I have you thinking about level of conflict here and about possibilities of different interpretation of this conflict, let's go back and actually reread verses 2 and 3 and then consider what they might really be saying. So I urge Euodia and I urge Syntyche to be the same mind in the Lord. Yes, and I ask you also, my loyal companion, to help these women, for they have struggled beside me in the work of the gospel, together with Clement and the rest of my co-workers whose names are in the book of life. We can observe in general that Paul's theology is always very concrete. That means his theology never deals with abstract ideas. He takes on real life situations, and in this case, he gets very specific. Euodia and Syntyche are singled out because they are in disagreement about something. What they are arguing about, we do not know. Could it be the classic, should we use wine or grape juice? Who knows? For reference, in other letters, when there's a disagreement in the church, Paul provides advice or weighs in on the specific argument. Let me give you 3 examples. Paul chastises the Galatians big time for turning to another gospel. In Corinthians, among other issues, he responds to the report of Chloe's people, again, specifics. Earlier in the book we're reading now, Philippians, he warns them to beware of those evil workers. Remember those dogs and body maulers. Note, whatever the issue is between Euodia and Syntyche, Paul chooses to leave the issue alone. As Atama says, the issue is probably not important from a theological or ethical perspective, because Paul does not take side with either one of the women. It's not important enough for Paul to take a side, then you ought to be asking, if this disagreement is not about something significant, why is Paul calling out these women by name in front of their congregation? Why doesn't he just leave it alone? Why doesn't he just save the parchment? Let's look at this from a different perspective. Whatever the topic, it was obviously something important to these 2 women. The reason Paul cannot just quit is not content to just leave the issue behind is because he believes their relationship is more important than their disagreement. Relationship is more important than their disagreement is the root issue for Paul. Then to now, how things stay the same. Like in the church of Paul's day, there is no limit to the creativity that the church can muster when it comes to finding something to disagree about. Wine or grape juice, or just attend a Presbyterian meeting sometime. We may not know what these two women disagree about, but we do know that these women were leaders in the church. We know that Paul appreciates them as, quote, they have struggled with Paul in the work of the gospel. Their names are written in the book of life, among that list of persons considered righteous by God. The fact alone that they are recognized as leaders of the church elevates the significance of their disagreement, whatever it is. We know, as Paul knew, when leaders disagree, the disagreement can spread through the whole church and beyond, almost independent of what the issues might be. So what is Paul's response again? He goes back to one of his mantras, urges them to be of the same mind. For Paul, being of the same mind is not the same thing as thinking alike. Euodia and Syntyche are in disagreement because they do not think the same way on some issue. Conventional wisdom would assume that to have the same mind, one of these two women would have to change her mind, has to be convinced of the errors of her ways of thinking, and has to come to agreement with the other. This response misses the point, misses Paul's point. They do not have to change what they think to have the mind of Christ. What it means to share the mind of Christ is to share the orientation of humility that was found in Christ. We are not always going to agree with one another. The best we can do is to share the humility or the humility orientation of Christ. It's unreasonable to hope that in some great day, let alone in the here and now, thoughts of all people in the world would align and harmony would emerge. Unreasonable to think that at some point we will all see the world exactly the same way. A corollary to this is, of course, it's equally unreasonable to assume that all those who do not share our enlightened perspectives will see the way we do and be converted over to our way. Paul's vision for the church is a community that learns to stay in relationship even when we see things differently. The exhortation in this letter is to do what can be done to ensure that any disagreement, which inevitably arises in life and in the church, does not devolve into personal division. Paul knows that having the same mind is a very lofty goal. Keep in mind, Paul is in jail, pleads for help. He appeals to his loyal companion to help these women. Who's Paul's loyal companion? And why does he not mention the person by name? Well, we can only speculate, but one speculation is that he does not name the person for fear that naming the person will result in that person suffering the same fate as he has, meaning being thrown in jail. We can remain in the dark of who is the loyal companion. People of Philippi, all likely knew. However, what is clear is Paul recognizes the truth that being faithful to the best of our abilities is seldom something we can achieve on our own. We all need help along the way. We need help in multiple ways. We need help to point out what we are too blind to see. We need help putting our thoughts into perspective. We need help to enable us to model humility and to testify to grace. None of us become our best selves by ourselves. The Christian journey is not a solo event. It can be particularly hard for leaders to admit in public that they need help. Paul is our role model in that he demonstrates that humility, admits that his limits. He appeals to his loyal companion for help because his friends need some help, and so does he. Would you agree, it seems to be a fact that when we find ourselves in disagreement, in the heat of the moment, the issue often seems more important than the relationship? That's almost an inherent characteristic. Almost automatic process for us is to determine first what side of the issue we are on, and whom or what do we believe is right. After all, we want to stand on the correct side, the right side of the issue. Now, I cannot deny that this is an important decision to make. Being called to have the mind of Christ, however, does not stop us from thinking about the issues or cause us to cease to have convictions about issues. However, having the mind of Christ does recognize that determining the correctness of the position or choosing the right side of the issue of the day does not complete our work. Having chosen what we believe to be right can be very satisfying. And with that satisfaction, we are tempted to say we have done what we can do, done what the gospel requires. But Paul would say, no, you have not. He insists there's more work to do, more work to remain in relationship with those on the other side of the issue. We still have to deal with those who do not see things our way. The shorthand way of saying this is the apostle teaches that it is not enough to be right, we must also be righteous. Right and righteousness may sound the same, but they are certainly not. Righteousness is a word that describes the nature of our relationships. To be righteous is to be in right relationship with God and with neighbor. Particularly in our current environment, getting to righteousness is often far more difficult than being right. Perhaps the strongest witness to Christ the church can offer is when there is disagreement, to work at reconciliation so that the disagreement does not devolve. Again, look at what Paul does from prison. He asks a third party, his loyal companion, to come alongside and remind Euodia and Syntyche just how much they have meant to each other. Don't be quick to give that up, he says. In this moment in time, we all need that loyal companion to come alongside us and remind us how important it is that we hold on to one another. Now that I've given you that challenging task of thinking about not right, just right, but righteousness. In closing, giving context to Paul's message, I ask that you heed and take some comfort in Paul's next element of advice and confirmation to what the Philippians and to us. Paul says, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Let your gentleness be known to everyone. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your request be known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard our hearts and our minds in Jesus Christ. Amen. Let's share